Our next speaker here this morning is Mike Pellant. Mike is a rehired annuitant for the BLM National Office, focusing on sage-grouse habitat assessments and restoration, and serving on the steering committees for the Joint Fire Sciences Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. Prior to retiring from the BLM full-time in December 2013, he was the coordinator for the BLM's Great Basin Restoration Initiative. Please welcome Mike Pellant.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks for the invite to visit with you all. I must admit, I live in Boise. I'm a Boise State football fan, and the Aggies put a big beat down on the Broncos, but great game by the Aggies. So what I'd like to do this morning is not tell you how to implement treatments in sage-grouse habitats, but go through a prioritization process that the BLM Forest Service has put in place to help make sure that we put projects in the right place to manage sage-grouse habitat. So we'll just jump into it. What I'm going to describe is called the Fire and Invasive Assessment Tool. I was the lead of the technical team that helped put this together. We had some really good wildlife biologists on it as well. And really the goal of this, I think, really says it: identify the best habitat for the most sage-grouse and manage, conserve, and restore these areas. So we've got a lot of sage-grouse habitat, a lot of conditions. How do we narrow it down to really make a difference make the biggest impact in terms of conserving sage-grouse? One thing I'm going to go through today, I'm not going to address the conifer encroachment. I'm just going to stick with the cheatgrass and wildfires. We had a little different process. I don't have time to discuss it, but just want you to know we also address conifer encroachment. Also, I apologize for the long website address. This is typical government, but this is a new portal that BLM's put up, and all of the fire and invasive assessments from the 5 different areas I talk about are posted here, along with the BLM's Rapid Eco-Regional Assessment. So it's kind of a one-stop shopping for all things landscape and BLM. So this tool was put together, and it was a nice kind of coming together of the resistance and resilience concepts, caught the attention of some of the upper level managers associated with sage-grouse, and it came down, let's utilize this concept, develop a tool to help us with prioritization. This general technical report, actually we have some out at our Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, so I'd encourage you to pick that up if you haven't seen it. But what we developed in this protocol, and I'll call the Fiat protocol, it's not a car, just the protocol we developed, was really a 2-step process, identifying these priority areas that we would focus on, and then develop management strategies. What would we do in these areas? So kind of the first level of stratification is the priority areas for conservation, or PACs. These were developed and really identify those key areas that have the greatest amount of threats, where we really need to focus our work. This is about 36 million acres, give or take. So obviously, if this was our prioritization level, we don't have much priorities. It's still a lot of acreage to deal with. So how do we narrow it down and kind of truly focus on the most important areas within these 5 PACs? Well, there's numerous PACs. We narrowed it down to 5. Well, if we look at the most sage-grouse, kind of the surrogate that the wildlife biologist on the team came up with was use the breeding bird density, 75% breeding bird density, which is the number of sage-grouse associated with the leks, where the strutting is done in the spring. And we identified these and called them focal habitats. So that's that next step down, is here's where we think most of the birds are, here's where we need to focus our attention in terms of interventions or conservation. Caveat, obviously, if you look at just the leks and use counts, it doesn't reflect the brood rearing or the winter habitat, but it was the best information that we had that basically covered the entire scope of sage-grouse. So what we ended up doing was first kind of narrowing down the number of priority areas of concern to these 5. And as you might imagine, this is still not a huge narrow down because this is where the majority of the acreage, but it's also where the majority of the sage-grouse were. So the next step, where do we go from here? One thing that is very critical to sage-grouse, obviously, is the amount of sagebrush on the landscape. So this isn't going out to a site and saying there's 20% sagebrush. This is looking at kind of with a rolling window approach, how much sagebrush is on the landscape. And so obviously where we're in this, when we were in the 0 to 25% level, basically sage-grouse don't inhabit those areas much anymore. If we get into 25 to 65%, the persistence of sage-grouse is better. We still have enough to manage for. And then obviously kind of our strongholds are these areas where large intact stands of sagebrush greater than 65%. So this gave us another way to kind of stratify that landscape and look at where sage-grouse are related to where the sagebrush is. Within this, we also, all of these reds we've seen several times already are fires. That's not to say that this habitat's lost forever. In cases where we have higher resistance and resilience, we have the potential for recovery. But for now, with the sagebrush gone, typically within a few years, the sage-grouse will leave that area until enough cover comes back. Rick addressed this. This is just kind of a graphical display of something I think as managers we all know. Down in the warmer, drier, lower elevations, lower precipitation, we've got more cheatgrass, and we have a harder time for recovery. We have a harder time to get seedings established. So that's our areas of lower resistance and resilience. But as we move up, we get into the mountain big sage, and especially in mountain big sage, mountain brush, we have a lot more potential for comeback after a disturbance. And we also have a lot less potential for cheatgrass and other invasive annual species. So what I really like about this concept of resistance and resiliency is that it's correlated to soil temperature and moisture regimes that Rick talked about. So now we can map it spatially. And so now we've got a landscape level look at what's the resistance and resiliency of the communities that occur on these soils. And so, again, we kind of look, the warm, dry, kind of the lowest resistance and resilience. We get up into these light blue, we obviously, have a lot more resistance resilience. So it's pretty easy to see, looking at all the red, we've got a lot of potential problem areas in terms of low resistance resilience and the potential for cheatgrass. So again, another kind of way to look at the landscape. Where it really came together for us was this matrix, which on the axis here we have our resistance and resiliency, so low to high, and across the top our sagebrush landscape cover, low, medium, and high. And basically with this we just go across, we don't compare up and down because there's different resistance and resiliency. But in our low resistance and resiliency, recovery is less likely all the way across. The big difference here is, do we really want to spend a lot of time and money in these less than 25% sagebrush landscape cover areas where sagebrush or sage-grouse aren't really inhabiting now? Now that's not to say that it's important to restore connectivity. We would still want to work in those kind of areas. But looking at that big landscape, that would be a lower priority. And so with this, we were able to then kind of employ a strategy. Now, how do we tie it to the management we want to do in these areas? So the outcome was this kind of potmark map. Again, our focal habitats are everything that's colored, including the areas that are black. These areas are crosshatched, but they appear black here, are that intersection of where we have the warm, dry habitat along with sagebrush greater than 25% landscape cover. The importance of this is, as a priority, as we know if we get a fire in these areas, they're not going to bounce back. We have a lot higher potential to conversion to cheatgrass. We're going to have a lot more difficult time trying to restore them because of our general lack of success in the lower elevations with a consistently being able to reestablish habitat. So we've called these darker areas our emphasis areas. Again, these are our focal habitats, and here's the outline of the priority areas of concern. So if we look at what we did graphically, we started out with roughly 35 million acres. If we just look at the focal habitats, we've cut that in half, which is a big step forward. But if we look at just where we have the warm, dry areas with the greater than 25% sagebrush cover, we're looking at about 6 million acres. That's still a lot, but at least now we've focused down our efforts into a smaller area. Now, having said that, I want to really make it clear that our approach is looking at doing treatments in or near these areas with a realization you don't go right to these boundaries and say, we're going to stop a fire right here. The fire starts rolling, you need to do it before. So a lot of these activities, we're looking outside of our focal habitats with the idea that if we don't do something further out, we're still going to see the disturbance within it. So that was kind of step one. We've kind of narrowed it down, identified these priority areas. And I think, to me, really the important part was in the step two process, we have teams, and I think we had well over 100 meetings like this, some of them done remotely, some of them face-to-face across the Great Basin, bringing in the wildlife specialists, the state wildlife specialists, BLM, and others, and now fine-tuning. Do we have better geospatial information than what this landscape level? Let's use it. An example, there was some areas where they've used telemetry and tracked sage-grouse movements, and it showed that, hey, they're using areas outside of what you've identified. So those were brought in as part of the priority areas to do management strategies. And the next part of this is then just starting to identify treatments, where you would put them, how many units, and just building that. And again, this is, everything that was developed in this stage has got to go through our NEPA process, environmental assessments and everything. So it's a bigger picture than we can actually do, but at least it provides some sideboards on what we need to do. So our management strategies, we've really taken, kind of divided into two approaches. This is kind of a concept developed through the Great Basin Restoration Initiative years ago. The proactive, the things you do before the disturbance. The reactive, the things you do to prevent or minimize the disturbance. And so these four, I'll just kind of briefly go through them. Fuels management, obviously, we're trying to change fire behavior, modify it, in aiding in suppression and reducing fire extent. Habitat restoration recovery. Restoration is that active component. We've crossed a threshold. We're going to have to go in and potentially reseed or do some type of management activity, reduce juniper, whatever. Whereas recovery is a more passive approach, change in management, change in livestock grazing, change in OHV use, those types of things where we can kind of bump it back into a little higher resistance and resiliency in case there is a disturbance. Those are our two proactive approaches. Fire operations, we often think of the tanker dropping, the slurry drops on the fire, but it's also about getting prepared for the fire season and fire prevention education. So in total, we're looking at, we call it fire operations. Obviously, suppression is the most important thing when the fire starts. And then post-fire rehabilitation, two different programs, the ES&R program, BLM, and the Forest Service Burned Area Emergency Rehab Program. One thing that you'll notice is the application of funds are now 3 years for stabilization, 5 years for rehabilitation. That was 2 years and 3 years. And so as part of this emphasis on sage-grouse, one of the recommendations that's really been put forward is we need more time to do rehabilitation after a fire. And that policy has been changed. So how does this all, what does it look like when these teams were working? Now this is kind of a hypothetical I just picked for this area right in here. And we're going to look at what's called project planning areas. So as they went through, they divided these areas up into these project planning areas to kind of give them a discrete boundary to work in, and then looked at that big picture. But again, this is hypothetical, but just kind of showing you This is outside of the priority areas, the focal habitats, but obviously if a fire starts in here, it could really affect either direction. Fuels management, again, we don't want to put it right on the boundary. So just the idea that in or near concept again. If we look at restoration, again, this connectivity, the potentially in here to do some restoration to connect these two habitats could be a priority. And last, post-fire rehabilitation. These are the warm, dry areas here, so if they burned, again, that was a higher priority than putting seed and money up into these areas that had a better potential for recovery. So that's pretty much how the process was set up to work. Kind of the next step, yeah, how many acres? This scares people away. When this all got aggregated and sent up to our Washington office, I think there were a few heart attacks. But the important thing is, as illustrated before, we're doing suppression is a high priority. If it burns, rehabilitation is a high priority. We want to do fuels projects, so these acreages are basically kind of stacked on top of each other in some of the important areas. Again, this seems like a lot, but what we're doing now is at least focusing our thoughts into these, the focal habitats. The 5,000 miles of fuel breaks was one of those big catch your breath things as well. But again, that's all going to be refined as you get into the planning process. It's not that all of this is going to be done. This is the sideboards on what needs to be done. So where does it go? This feeds into our land use plan amendments, both BLM and Forest Service. There's actually an appendix that has the Fiat protocol, and that's how we are guiding kind of moving forward with where we're going to do treatments through our land use plans. So I'm not going to say any more on that because I'm not a planner, but what I'd like to do now is change a little bit and talk about a secretarial order. Sally Jewell, the Department of Interior Secretary, issued in January of this year. And it's rangeland fire prevention, management, and restoration. And the idea is, what can we do to change some of the things right now to not only conserve habitat for sage-grouse, but also other wildlife species, economic activity. This is said right in it, ranching, recreation. So the realization, this isn't just about sage-grouse. These fires and the invasive annual grasses are affecting a lot more than just these components of the landscape. So, as typical, you have to have an implementation plan. The secretarial order is 3 or 4 pages long, and the implementation plan is, I don't know, 40 or 50. So there's a lot of tasks associated with it. Everything, the prioritization, so again, the Fiat process is incorporated in numerous locations in this strategy, actually. What I want to do now is focus on 2 of the planned components, the fuels and the removal of non-native grasses at a landscape level. If you want a good overview of Fiat, this implementation strategy has an appendix that kind of goes through the steps and summarizes the whole process. And the reason I bring the fuels and the non-native grass removal at the landscape level up is there are 3 tasks in this implementation order that have to do with targeted grazing to reduce fuels. The first one is looking at opportunities to support livestock permittees and private landowners. So it's BLM Forest Service working with NRCS on the private lands, get the state involved. How can we do a strategic landscape approach in terms of managing fuels? How can we use livestock to help us better do that? So most of this, the deadlines are for like the landscapes, March of 2016. I think the Fiat areas are that's going to be the direction we're going to go, again, in or near. And then fund work in 2017. So things are going to start happening on the ground in terms of targeted grazing to reduce fuels in the near future. The next one is exploring incentives. If you work for BLM and you've got a permittee, you know, it's not fair to say, can you do us a big favor, spend a lot of time and money, water and fencing, doing other things to manage fuels strategically? How can we incentivize that so that we actually are changing the paradigm from livestock grazing to pay a fee to paying for livestock grazing to manage fuels? So I think this is going to be an interesting component we're going to explore. Again, we have the Sage-Grouse initiative within our CS that's doing a lot of good things and could be utilized on the private lands. But again, remember, this is strategic and at a landscape level. So it's not a allotment here and a ranch there scattered across the landscape. It's how can we kind of tie this together. And the last one, kind of the interesting one on the ground, is large-scale removal of invasive grasses. So how do we develop grazing plans for reducing annual grass fine fuels? And I think the key here is due to the variability in production of cheatgrass, the Snake River Plain, it can go from 0 in a drought year to 2,000 pounds per acre in a wet year. So I think there's a lot of challenges is how do you manage these fine fuels, giving the forage base that is has a very wide variability. Agreements and standards in place for use by October, again, 2017. So things are going to start, pilot projects, demonstration areas, 2016, 2017. The plans are to have this ramped up a bit so that we're actually doing it on the landscapes in some key areas. So the status of this, we have a core team. Right now it's federal and state government representatives. We have a thing called the Federal Advisory Council Act, which really puts some constraints on involving non-governmental entities participating on work groups or teams that could be decisional in nature. Long story short, we're looking into that, but the bottom line is there's going to be ample opportunity for outside review and input as we go through this process. Especially the livestock community, we know that that's got to be part of helping us to develop this. So through NRCS contacts, through our contacts with our BLM permittees, how can we make this work together? So I just want to point out in a couple minutes here, one of our early accomplishments on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. This is a new website, and I'll just highlight this secretarial order, the Rangeland Fire one. This is the wording in the implementation plan. Basically, this is going to be the primary delivery system for the science information for management and the science community. So this is, we've got right now around 30 papers, publications on targeted grazing. Take a look at that, download them, use them. If you have additional ones that aren't in there, just send them to the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. We'll get them posted. Another thing I'll point out right here are these Great Basin fact sheets. We do have a table out there. Talk to Janie or Margie. We have, I think, 3 or 4 of these fact sheets that you can take a look at. So these are kind of the Cliff Notes version of the science. And this is something, excuse me, Gene Chambers and others have kind of initiated. Really encourage you to look at that. Just move on to, just a couple more slides. These are a couple of the publications, and I show this because the Murphy Complex fire in 2007 burned 650,000 acres, and I spent a day in a helicopter, and as far as I could see in a helicopter, all I could see was black. And I've worked for BLM for about 40 years now, and it's probably the most memorable day in my career in terms of something's got to change. And what it really drove home to me is that our fuels management needs to be at the scale of the fire. And when we have this large a fire, we have to have larger contiguous fuel breaks or we don't have a chance. So anyway, this the report, one of the major findings was in herbaceous fuels in grass communities, cheatgrass crested, we can make a difference. If we get into sagebrush, it's basically burning as a crown fire now. 30 years ago when I fought fire, you had to light the cheatgrass on fire to light the sagebrush on fire to do a backfire. Talking to the fire people, on the fire crews on this, you just put the fusee on the sagebrush and it would, sometimes they said it almost exploded. So times are changing. I think with climate and everything, our fires are changing. The second one is something we did through Great Basin Restoration Initiative, just kind of going through how would we implement targeted grazing at a landscape scale on public land. So encourage you to take a look at those publications if you're interested in this and all of the others that are posted on the website. The last thing, just this is basically hot off the press. It's not in publication, but it's online now. It's a restoration handbook. This is the first of 3 volumes on this. The next 2, this is kind of the landscape look at restoration. The next 2 kind of get down into a more detailed look. So with that, I will close with a proverbial sunset. And again, the contact information, especially with anything on the targeted grazing, please get a hold of me. And one thing I didn't mention, we want case studies. So we're going to be putting out a query on case studies kind of in a format so that they all look about the same. Some of it just punch a button and the rest of it some narratives. So we'd really encourage, we really want to build the experience. We've got some of the science on targeted grazing and fuels. What's your experience? So I'd encourage you to watch for that. Again, the website, the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. Anyway, with that, I think I'm about on time, and I'll end. Oh. Okay.
And all these talks will be archived on our website, restorationwest.org, in the future. Question here?
Great talk. I was just curious, thinking longer term about the targeted grazing plots, which I think is a great idea. If, again, 10, 20 years down the road, if those grazing plots, the animals have grazed out the grasses and forms, but then again would leave behind the woody species, would you anticipate those, what start as fuel breaks to turn into areas where you actually have higher fuels if they're not eating the sagebrush?
Yeah, and good point, Jen. And again, this is just one tool in the toolbox. We've got a lot of other fuels management strategies. Some of them will be talked about today. There's posters. With the sagebrush, kind of the most common practice now is going in with large mowers basically and reducing the sagebrush, reducing that fuel load with the sagebrush. So yeah, this is, and I don't want to give the impression this is just do this everywhere. When you get into sagebrush stands, obviously you're going to have to look at reducing fuels. It's not going to be with livestock, so how can you do that? And again, the whole idea with this is, I know we're taking some sagebrush out, but we've got to lose a little to save a lot, and that balance is what we're going to have to really work on with the wildlife biologists. So thanks for the question. Stan.
Just curious, to what extent the future climate change was considered in the prioritization process as you were looking at resilience, resistance, and area, and so forth. How much did you consider climate change in informing that process?
Another good question. Basically, the funding for what we're doing right now, we're looking at conditions now. But the realization that those higher resiliency areas potentially in the future become more important. So, at this point, we're still trying to save the Wyoming big sagebrush. At some point, as things change, we may have to change that. But right now, it's just based pretty much on current conditions. Yes.
What was Utah excluded in the PI prioritization maps?
Actually, there's a combination. The one that I showed where the dots, the colored dots in all of them, Utah was in there. So through this process, originally a couple of the Utah packs weren't identified as within that scope of the 5 priority packs. Later in the process, they were brought in. So there's a number of areas in Utah, and I could bring that back up, but some of the slides reflected earlier versions of what where our priorities would be. So sorry about this, but I just want to make it clear so that we don't I don't want to leave Utah out because, oops, there we go. So again, things that were brought in Utah, these areas were all added in later, so they're all part of the priority packs. Not all the packs everywhere were identified as priorities. Does that help?
Yeah, just a couple of your maps still had.
Yeah, and I apologize, I should have pointed that out. They were earlier versions. This came in basically at the end of the fiat process. These were added back in after we'd actually done everything, so.
Last question.
So, you had mentioned to someone that you're trying to restore and maintain the white and sage-grouse habitats in the lower elevations. And it seems like the scientific consensus is that's going to take multiple consecutive years. Does that build into the fiat process, that there will be multiple years?
Yeah, the question is, how do we build multiple years into this? It's not, kind of a one-time thing in these low elevations. And yeah, with the management strategies that were developed, the detail wasn't down. We're going to, treat it for 3 years and then seed it. But the sideboards on activities, management strategies there are, you're going to have to potentially have multiple interventions to get you back to that point. So that's really that step 3, if you will, where you start looking at a project area. What are we going to do here? How are we going to implement it? That's where we, I think, bring in the detail of the treatments and how long it might take.
Let's give Mike a big hand.